Afghanistan. Obviously, Pakistan will have a lot to do with that, but we'll be focusing on Afghanistan for the most part. Give this just a second to warm up. We're going to talk a little bit about background, how the situation came to be. We'll try and get through that fairly quickly because there's an awful lot of stuff to talk about in terms of what's going on in Afghanistan and so forth. So hopefully this will warm up very quickly. Alright, this is a fairly big PowerPoint, so it might take you just a second to load once we get ready. Alright, so we're going to talk about Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's important to understand the relationship between these two countries. Right, it's important to understand not only their geographic location, but also cultural affinities between the two, political discrepancies between the two. This line that runs right down through the middle, that we call this international border. Not a lot of people necessarily that live in that area respect that line. We talked about that a little bit in previous discussions about how some of these international borders are not very clearly defined. The people that live in the area disregard them regularly, move across them as if they're not there, etc. So this is a pretty important region to understand those divisions. We'll go back through a little bit of history just to indicate why some of these issues are happening. We'll try to cover some history pretty quickly in this one. The Silk Route was an important trade connection between Far East Asia and Europe, the Mediterranean world, the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, India, and Afghanistan occupied a fairly interesting point in that right in the middle. And so it experienced a lot of various empires. You can see it lists the Persian, the Greek, the Chinese, the Roman, the Byzantine, the Islamic, the Mongol, and the West European empires have all kind of moved through this area as they're going on conquest, as they're going through trade, as they're going through a variety of different movements in their own empires. And it sits, right here in the middle of all of this, as all of this is going on between East and West. Yet not very many of them were able to establish their control over the area. They certainly had influence to varying degrees, but the control of trade and the basic rule was basically held by a variety of different kingdoms, dynasties, and so forth within that particular region. It's kind of a wayfaring spot. The Mughal Empire is one of the first to establish a long-term authority. When we think about this, we often think about India, the Taj Mahal, the Islamic leaders within north and western India, but they controlled much of this area. They were also Islamic, they were Muslims, and so they're one of the first ones that really establishes a little bit more of control over this region as an empire per se. In the mid-18th century to mid-19th century or so, the Durrani Empire, second largest Muslim empire in the world after the Ottomans, and that's really where we start to see this idea of Afghanistan starting to form. Right? It's really the foundation of that modern state of Afghanistan. You can see the outline of Afghanistan on this map, and that was really the heart of that empire. Now they expanded out beyond that, where they had influence over other states, but that's really the foundation of Afghanistan. Now, in the mid-19th to early 20th centuries, you have this area of Afghanistan kind of crunched in here in what we often call the Great Game. The Great Game was an imperial struggle, a colonial struggle, imperial struggle between Russia and largely the British Empire, not even on this map. Right? Britain doesn't even show up on this map, but they have essentially control of what is known as British India. Both of them are struggling to keep each other at bay. They're kind of fighting proxy wars against one another, at the same time trying to expand their own empires. And this place called Afghanistan, at least called Afghanistan today, is kind of caught in the middle of that, right? Caught between these two European powers that are struggling with each other. There's a number of different wars that are fought between the Anglos and the Afghans. In 1893, they established what's called the Durrani Line, and that is what we consider the modern-day border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Right? And sometimes it's recognized, and sometimes it's not, etc., etc., etc. The Third Anglo War is fairly significant in that it followed World War I, when Britain was a little bit hurting from having fought World War I, and so the Afghan Empire tried to take advantage of that a little bit. They invaded British India. They were quickly repelled, and following that, the Afghan Empire basically said, cool, it's all yours, we're not going to mess with you anymore. Okay, so that's a little bit of that history and how that comes into being, how Afghanistan has been caught in between these great powers operating in this region, and still is today, as we'll come to see. So modern Afghanistan. Afghanistan is essentially declares itself a sovereign nation, an independent state in 1919. And it's ruled as a monarchy, clear until 1973 when there's a coup. When the monarch is out of town, is out of the country, going around, and there's a coup while he's out of town to establish a president in the country. It's kind of important to understand that Afghanistan was largely a neutral country, both in World War I and in World War II. In World War I, the Ottoman Empire pressed them heavily to try to get them to join in the Central Powers against to join Ottoman Turkey and German Empire against the other powers. They refused. In World War II, they also stayed neutral. They kind of played both sides against each other. In the Cold War, you have both the United States and the Soviet Union trying to gain influence and interest in Afghanistan because of the strategic location that it has. Right? It's on the southern flank of the Soviet Union, and it's on the northern flank of India and the Persian Gulf. Right? So it represents an important spot right there. In 1978, a communist party takes power in Afghanistan through force, through fighting, and it ushers in a period of civil war where the Soviet Union steps in to prop up the Afghan government, and both Pakistan and the United States support tens of thousands of Mujahideen guerrillas, a lot of them being Arab by ethnicity. They come from the Arabian Peninsula, they go into Afghanistan where they get trained and funded by the United States and Pakistan, and they fight against the government and their Soviet backers. And the Soviet Union gets steadily and steadily more and more and more pulled into this conflict. A lot of people talk about the parallel with Afghanistan essentially being the Soviet Union's Vietnam War. And it's very similar in a lot of different ways. Different as well, but similar in a lot of ways. And the Soviet Union gets more and more and more pulled in, and eventually they just decide, gee, we just can't take control of the place. We're losing too many people, too much machinery, too much money, and so they withdraw. They're finally pushed out in 1989. Throughout that period, over 1 million Afghans died. Right? So this is a severe devastation going on in this country, and significantly, it creates over 6 million refugees. It's the largest refugee problem on the face of the planet, even bigger than the number of Palestinian refugees, or at least certainly equal in size and severity. So a pretty serious situation happens. The Soviet Union pulls out, but it takes another couple of years for the Soviet-backed government to collapse. When the Soviet-backed government collapsed, there's an attempt to create a unity government within the nation, bringing all powers together, but not everybody agrees. In fact, a lot of outside powers, a lot of nations around the world or in the region, start meddling in the affairs of Afghanistan. You have Pakistan supporting militias within Afghanistan, things that turn into the Taliban. Pakistan is supporting that. Iran is supporting Shia militias within Afghanistan. Saudi Arabia is supporting anti-Shia militias within Afghanistan. So Iran and Saudi Arabia, hopefully you all understand that Iran and Saudi Arabia are big-time rivals. Always have been. Big-time rivals. Not only because Saudi Arabia is predominantly Sunni and kind of the heart of the Sunni world, but Iran is predominantly Shia. And when we say predominantly, we're talking about, like 97% in each country. And Saudi Arabia are made up of Arabs, ethnically speaking, whereas Iran is predominantly Persian, ethnically speaking. Okay, so a lot of animosity between these two, and they kind of fight a war with each other in Afghanistan by supporting different groups. It's a proxy war. Okay, so they're fighting all of this going on. So in this situation, you have all kinds of chaos going on, different militias fighting each other, warlords in control of different parts of the country, as well as these outside powers pouring tons of money in. A lot of you probably are aware of some of the criticism of the United States that the United States supported the training and funding of the Mujahideen guerrilla fighters in stopping the Soviet Union, but once the Soviet Union withdrew, the United States basically washed their hands of the situation and walked away because they had accomplished their goal of stopping the Soviet Union from expanding. So they accomplished their strategic goal and they were done, right? What was left was a country that had been torn apart. Remember, 6 million refugees, 1 million dead, plus wholesale destruction of the country, all these splinter groups. And then we pulled out our influence and it created a huge power vacuum in which everybody fought. The nation that finally rose to the top of that heap was the Taliban. They finally rose to the top of that heap, and they largely find their base of support in southern Afghanistan, their headquarters primarily being around Kandahar, okay, and with support of the Pakistani intelligence services. They get a lot of support and help from Pakistan as they grow and develop. They finally take over Kabul. The government forces in Kabul move up to the northern parts. They're largely Uzbek and Tajik in ethnicity. They move up to the northern parts of the country where they carve out their own little enclave that they hold on to. But the Taliban basically establishes its control over much of the rest of the country. They impose strict Islamic law. They essentially take 1/2 of the population, the women, and basically confine them to house arrest, right? And they're beaten and flogged if they're outside of their home, outside of the presence of a man that they're from their family. If they show their face, they are beaten, right? They're not allowed to go to school, etc. Okay, so it also becomes a safe haven for Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is an organization that develops from the Mujahideen guerrillas, the Arab guerrillas that are fighting in Afghanistan. They stay. They didn't leave. They stayed around and they participate in all of this fighting that's going on. So when the Taliban takes control, they allow safe haven for Al-Qaeda to be there. They're like, yeah, okay, you can operate within our borders, and they allow them to be there safely. So from 1992 to 2001, during this civil war, you have 500,000 Afghan civilians die, as well as just absolute destruction across the country. Okay, the place is just completely torn apart. We also know about the U.S. occupation, and that's probably where most of us in this country start paying attention to any of this, right? Is because it suddenly involves the United States, and therefore we care about it. So, following the attacks of September 11, the United States invades, topples the Taliban, and then seeks to rebuild the nation, right? And that's where we're going to start kind of jumping in terms of debate kind of issues. One other thing I want to jump back in here and just say one thing quickly. The United States thought that the Soviet Union was intervening in order to expand their borders. There's a history of the Soviet Union expanding its borders. However, there's maybe another narrative at play in all this as well. In 1979, what happens in Iran? Islamic Revolution takes place. Around that same time, Afghanistan is becoming increasingly Islamicized, if we can make that a word. I think that's actually a word, right? Islamic influence is becoming more and more significant. So the other narrative would say the Soviet Union was not necessarily trying to expand its borders imperially. They were just going in to try and create a buffer, a safe zone on their southern flank to keep Islamic radicalism from moving north into its own country. Were there millions of Muslims within the Soviet Union at that time? Indeed there were. These places called Tajikistan and Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan and Kyrgyzstan and Chechnya and Dagestan and etc. Millions and millions and millions of Muslims within the Soviet Empire, and they were concerned about the events that were going on in Iran and Afghanistan creeping northward and creating internal problems for them. So they just wanted to kind of tamp that down and create a buffer state that would kind of create some, protection from that radicalization. So kind of a different view of all that happened. We all okay here so far? I know we're covering this stuff quickly. You can also review it, when you look at the PowerPoint later. So let's talk about a few things and the reasons why this is relevant to us in the debate world. Let me ask you a couple of questions. Why might the issue of Afghanistan be a likely topic of your debates? Anybody? Why might it be something that comes up in your debates this year?
It's still unstable.
It's what?
It's still unstable.
It's ongoing, right? The United States has been fighting in Afghanistan longer than the United States has fought in any war in American history. Longest war in American history. All right, pretty significant. Yes?
Is this the war that they were calling the 10-year war?
Yeah, it could be. I mean, there are probably lots of different names. But yeah, it's been going on for over 10 years, right? And so, has it gotten better? It all kind of depends. It was a little bit hotter probably 2-3 years ago than maybe it is today. But is it stable? No, there are people dying every single day. There are gunfights and battles every single day. There are IEDs exploding every single day. There are car bombs every single day. There are raids of villages every single day. There are major battles all the time. So this is still happening. It's an ongoing issue. What might happen next year? 2014. That's the timetable for the withdrawal of U.S. forces. All right, so that's a pretty big issue as well. So essentially some of the reasons why we might debate this are because of the magnitude. Right? There's a lot of people that have been dying here. There's a lot of money that has been spent on. It's cost about, I don't know, maybe $1 trillion so far, all told, on all sides. In addition, there's this issue of urgency. We might withdraw next year. It still remains to be seen exactly what's going to happen. There's no agreement. That's just what the timetable is. Right? So it's certainly an issue of big magnitude and also urgency, but it's also an issue that affects not only the country that we happen to live and debate in, it's also an issue of pretty significant geopolitical, clout. It's important geopolitically. It's important in NATO's role in the world. It's important in understanding the relationship between Russia and the Western world, because this is on Russia's southern flank. There's a couple of new countries in between, but it's essentially Russia's southern flank. It also has a whole lot to do with relations between these two countries called India and Pakistan. They're kind of playing out a little proxy battle with each other in Afghanistan as well, jockeying with each other for influence in Kabul. Right? So this is a major world kind of issue. So what are some of the specific issues that we might debate? Well, we might debate this timeline for withdrawal. We might debate things like changes in NATO's tactics. Should we negotiate with the Taliban? The United States is a country that doesn't negotiate with terrorists, and yet we're beginning to realize that there's not going to be a military solution to the conflict in Afghanistan. Maybe we're going to have to sit down at the table and have conversations with the Taliban about how to solve this politically. We might debate things like the drug war, right? Afghanistan has the dubious distinction of being the #1 producer of opium and heroin in the world, opiates in the world. They also happen to have the dubious distinction of being the #1 source of refugees in the world. So we could debate a number of those different kinds of issues. Some other things that might come up. We could talk about India-Pakistan relations. We could talk about the role of Russia and or Iran, who are important players in that area. We could talk about the role of U.S. leadership and credibility. If the United States tucks its tail between its legs and runs home, how is that going to affect our hegemonic credibility around the world? Does it tell militant organizations and rogue nations and pariahs around the world, you know, the United States will come with a lot of firepower, but if you can just manage to stay alive for a while and inflict a few wounds, that they don't have the political stomach for seeing their own blood spilled, and they will run away home because they weren't able to get it over with in quick succession. And so maybe that sends a message to others. It also is already sending a message to others about, you know, the strength of the U.S. military. What is it really capable of? Right? So it's sending lots of messages to the whole world how the United States behaves and the kind of policy implications that come out of that. There's a lot happening, and it has a significant influence. So, what do we need to know in order to effectively debate this issue? The answer to that is quite simply a lot of stuff. We got to know a lot. There's a lot going on, so we need to look into some of that, which is what we're going to do now. First of all, when we talk about Afghanistan, we have to know a little bit about who's who and what's where. We have to understand, you know, the geographical location. We also have to understand demographic distribution. There's a lot at play here. So I think it's pretty useful to kind of look at maps. It gives you an idea of how these things are laid out in this country and literally who's who and what's where. So you can see the main area of conflict is in here. Right? That's where the Taliban is largely operating. Now, this region in here, you can see this dotted line. That's that Durrani line, right? The thing that we recognize as the international border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. But do the Pashtuns, and remember the Pashtuns are an ethnic group. The Pashtuns are not Greek. The Pashtuns are not Arab. The Pashtuns are not Tajik. The Pashtuns are not Korean. The Pashtuns are not Persian. The Pashtuns are Pashtun, right? Their own independent ethnic grouping. They have their own language, their own thoughts, their own beliefs, etc. And there's millions of them on each side of this border. They don't really recognize this thing so much. Right? As far as they're concerned, it's all their land. Okay, so that's kind of an important thing to understand, that these sections right in here, North Waziristan, South Waziristan, you also have, you know, these areas that are called the federally administered tribal areas. In here, this area, Pakistan does not have control over them. They're largely lawless, or rather there's a local law, but it's not Pakistani law. Right? And so even though they're close by Islamabad, a lot of this region is independently governed by whoever happens to have the power in the region. Various warlords, etc., terrorist organizations, various tribal elders. Okay, so there's a lot going on in there that we have to understand, that it's more than just, well, the United States is fighting Afghanistan. It's not that simple. It's far, far, far more complicated than that. Yeah, Lee?
I know we ran appendix and asked your perspective, but is it that corner, like Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, isn't that like one of the biggest like areas where illegal drug trade crosses between them?
A lot of it. A lot of the opium production is down here, or heroin production, sorry, is down here. Opiates is down in this region, although it's all over. But most of the production is down in here, which means it's getting into Iran. A lot of it goes north to Russia. Right? A lot of it goes north to Russia, so much to the point where Russia, a couple of years ago, Dmitry Medvedev, he said that he considers the drug use or drug abuse problems in Russia, the heroin abuse in Russia, a national security threat because of how devastating it is. I mean, when people get strung out on heroin, you can't work, right? They become, dependent on social services, etc. It's very highly problematic, and so many people are struggling with that in Russia that it's amongst the younger, generation. There aren't people to fill jobs. There's all kinds of healthcare problems. That's pretty serious when you consider your drug problem a national security threat, right? So they're very concerned about it.
Are there any particular regions that the drug trade is being transported through?
If this is Afghanistan, if that's Afghanistan, and this is the area where largely the poppies are being grown, although it's all over. The materials that come from this are going like this. Going everywhere, right? There are major flows going up north into Russia, right? Major flow going north into Russia, but it's going everywhere. One of the places that they maybe don't go so much, and this is maybe kind of a little important thing for you to think about in future debate rounds. I know we've used it many times. This country over here is Iran, right? The flow does not go across this border so much. Why? Because Iran kills people on this border. And if they think you're traveling across the border with drugs, your life is probably in greater danger than if you're in here fighting against NATO. So there have been times when I know that our teams have said, you know, counter plan, let's have the Iranian border patrol or the Iranian drug police train the Afghani drug police, or train the Tajiks and the Uzbeks on how to control the drug trade, because they're better at it. They're brutal, for one, but they're also highly skilled, right? And so that's kind of an important little piece to know about all of that. Plus they just are completely zero tolerance of drugs.
I get in debate you can get around this issue, but would they actually be willing to do that? Like, is that something that Iran would be willing to
Iran would
spend
be
resources
really,
on?
really psyched if it could have more influence in Afghanistan.
Okay.
Right? In fact, in the early days when the United States was looking to go into Afghanistan to topple the Taliban, there were apparently some, communiques that were exchanged between the United States and Iran, where Iran essentially said, hey, we'll help you. They didn't like the Taliban. Right? The Taliban is Sunni, and they hate the Shias, and so there was a significant concern there. They support the Hazaris in the western part of Afghanistan, and so they kind of made some brief interludes to say, hey, we'll help you out. We'll help you out in this. People think that all Islamic movements are the same, and they're not. The Islamic Revolution and the Islamic theocracy within Iran, the Iranian leadership, and Al-Qaeda, there's far greater animosity between those two groupings than there is between Al-Qaeda and the United States of America. Far greater animosity between them for maybe one specific reason, well, two reasons. One, they're more local to each other, so they're in closer proximity to one another. But as far as a lot of these Islamic movements are concerned about the other Islamic movements, they're Muslim. They should know better. Right? Which is one of the reasons why Saddam Hussein and Islamic movements also had no love lost between them. Saddam Hussein had a history of crushing Islamic movements. Hosni Mubarak had a history of crushing Islamic movements. The House of Saud has a history of crushing Islamic movements. And so those Islamic movements hate them because it's not only their own local ruler, but because they're Muslim. And as far as they're concerned, they should know better. So it's even greater sin than the Christian devils across the sea. You understand? I'm using, strong language here, but that's kind of the idea, that there's a far greater concern about the local infidels than there is about the infidels across the sea. Does that make sense? Right? Far greater concern. And so a lot of times we talk about, Iran, they're supporters of all Islamic terrorism. Well, we think that they probably do support some Islamic terrorism, but not Al-Qaeda. Right? They support Hezbollah. They support Hamas. They support the Houthi rebels in northern Yemen. They support the Shia rebels, Shia militias in Iraq. But, that would be kind of like Barack Obama in the middle of the campaign season having given, $100 million of his war chest to Mitt Romney. They're opposites in so many ways, right? They do not get along, except for that, Mitt Romney and Barack Obama weren't firing guns at each other as well. Okay, so you have to understand some of these significant differences. We also have to understand where NATO's operating. We'll get back to some of those diversity questions here in just a moment. But we also have to understand where NATO's operating, because it makes a difference. This is not just a U.S. operation. NATO is in charge here. They're running the ISAF, International Security Assistance Force. Right? They're running that. It's a NATO peacekeeping force. There's a small contingent of U.S. soldiers that are not under the umbrella NATO group, right? That are a separate force that's operating in the region strictly under U.S. authority, command and control, and they're in some of the hotter regions fighting here along the border, whereas NATO is taking some of these other areas. So it's kind of important to know how big the force is, as well as who's involved in what.
Wow.
Because when we talk about international relations and the relationship, you know, if Germany and the United States aren't getting along on something, that has implications for the NATO, for what's going on in Afghanistan. When Britain and Spain are having a tussle over Gibraltar, it has implications for what's going on in Afghanistan. Okay, so all of those things kind of interact. Just another map of where the United States has troops and where things are located, as well as where the heavy fighting is actually taking place. We'll take a look at that later. It's also important to lay another layer on top of this. This is not just the Taliban that's fighting. There are individual terrorist networks that are big players in this that are not Al-Qaeda, like the whole Haqqani network is a significant player. So you can see that these are different places where individual warlords have their own influence. And this is just a big map. There are probably 50 different ones that have influence in here. And other groups that have smaller areas in here. Their own little fiefdom, right? That they are the ones that have control in a particular area. Maybe our best parallel would be to think about the drug cartels in Mexico and Colombia in such a way that they control turf. Right? Something kind of similar happening here, that these different warlords control turf throughout the region. Some of them fight each other, some of them enter into alliances with one another. This one will give you a better idea of how diverse this country is. Significantly so. And some of the differences are terrific. Really big, big differences. So we have to understand where the Baluchis are. We also have to understand that this place called Baluchistan is partly in Afghanistan, partly in Pakistan, and partly in Iran. And they've been fighting for separation from those three countries for years and years and years and years and years. And so those are the kind of things you have to understand in order to really get into the nuances and details of the conflict that is going on in Afghanistan. Because if you're telling a story about Baluchi separatists and the actions that they're carrying out, it's going to sound a whole lot more compelling to your critic than somebody that's just talking about, well, NATO forces are fighting Afghanis. It's a lot more complicated than that. And your story, depending on how sophisticated it gets, is a whole lot more compelling, not only because it sounds like you know a lot more, but because you're more based in reality and what is actually happening in this conflict. All right, so very, 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 very complex and complicated. You don't have to know everything. You couldn't possibly know everything. I've been paying attention to this stuff for 10 years, and it still boggles my mind. Okay, so this is complicated stuff. You don't have to know all of it, but try to know some of it. The more nuanced your position is, the more likely it is to be, one, valid, and two, persuasive to your critic. So what are some of the significant challenges that we face in this situation? First and foremost that probably comes to our mind is just the loss of lives. Anybody know how many U.S. soldiers have lost their lives in the war in Afghanistan, or roughly? Anybody?
So 5 years?
How many?
5,000?
Probably a little bit less than that. Probably a little bit less than that. Some of the recent numbers coming from the Pentagon indicate about 2,500. There may be much higher than that, depending on how things are counted. For instance, somebody that is wounded in battle, that gets flown out to the, into Jordan or to the hospitals in Germany and dies there from their battle wounds, doesn't get counted in the toll. Right? Also, part of the number is higher because it's not just, well, first of all, this is tearing families apart across this country. This is tearing our society apart across this country. Very, very significant, but it's not just Americans that are losing their lives. You also have Canadian soldiers, you also have German soldiers, you also have British soldiers, you also have Dutch soldiers, you also have Polish soldiers, you also have soldiers from Spain, you also have people from a variety of different places that have also been impacted by this. But it's not just people who are fighting for NATO, there's also Afghanis that are losing their lives. We have no idea, probably, how many Afghanis have lost their lives in this conflict over the past 10 years. Because it's very, very difficult to do a body count during a war. Somebody probably at NATO headquarters has a decent idea. You would think, right? Because, you know, was it Schwarzkopf, I think, was the U.S. general that was famous for saying, we don't do body counts. I would say bullshit. The U.S. military absolutely does body counts, and if they're not doing body counts, then they're not doing their job. They have to keep track of that kind of stuff in order to know whether or not they're being successful, in order to know whether or not they need to change strategies and tactics, in order to know how things are happening. If we want to try and do this hearts and minds strategy where we try and make people like us, we have to know what's going on the ground. They absolutely know, they just don't want it to be political fodder for the media and for public discussion, which tactically and strategically also makes sense.
Yeah, we were reading, because we took a class on this last year, and we were reading that in the Fata region of Pakistan, whenever we send drone strikes to kill insurgents, that the way in which we count the amount of insurgents that were hit was that any male in the region who is of combat age, which is usually about 18 and over, is classified as an insurgent, according to our military counts.
We keep detailed record. We just don't make that record available. Right? So, death and destruction. You also have to remember that a lot of these countries in this region, I don't know what the number is. This would be an interesting to look at, but I can tell you that that in Iraq, the population of Iraq is greater than 50% under the age of 15 years old. I know that this is also a very young country, which means that kids are growing up having lost parents, having lost brothers, having lost an arm, having lost an opportunity to go to school for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years in a row. So you have to wonder what this country is going to do over the next 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years as this young generation didn't have the opportunity to go to school, didn't have the opportunity to live, be healthy because they were constantly struggling to find food. They didn't have the opportunity to just be kids. And so the relationship that has not only internally, but the way they look at the outside world, is a pretty big question, right? We talk about PTSD, right, with soldiers coming back from the war. There's PTSD going on inside the country as well, and probably to a much greater extent because they are living there, they're staying there. They also don't have the resources to come back and go through therapy, etc., etc. Right? So pretty significant concern about the aftermath of this. You also have millions of refugees that are living in these squalid camps with no hope of returning in the near future. What do we do with the situation of refugees that are living in horrible conditions? Right? Significant concern about the refugees. Another issue, a significant challenge in this conflict is that there is, what is being fought is what we might call asymmetrical warfare. Asymmetrical warfare meaning imbalanced. It's not symmetrical. It's way out of whack. Right? Really imbalanced. The United States and NATO has not only some pretty incredible technology, but they also have tons of it, and they have tons of supply coming in all of the time. High-tech, top-of-the-line, best equipment on the face of the planet, lots of it, and being resupplied regularly and consistently. In particular, the air power that we have. I mean, we often think of these drones as being like that, the ones that fly around and blow up things with the missiles, as Brandon's just mentioning, the that carry out the drone strikes over in Pakistan. But look at this little sucker that gets launched by the soldier, the airman, just going and tossing it into the air like a model airplane. Right? That one's not armed. That's eye in the sky. That's the one that's floating around and taking pictures and following movements and everything like that. But also, you know, helicopter gunship. Look how far that is from the ground. Yet he's able to sit up there. He, she, I don't know, is able to sit up there in that aircraft, you know, half a mile above the earth and boom, 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 plug away at things on the ground that can't, you know, barely even see it. Right? So significant difference in that technology and this technology. Substantial difference in which is why we call it asymmetrical warfare. You know, top end over here is an RPG, AK-47s. They're riding around in pickup trucks, right? Yeah.
Just quickly, an ex-boyfriend of mine actually went to Iraq and Afghanistan, both. He was a Marine, and said that they would be being, like, these roadside bombs would blow up, and things like forks and knives, like they would be attacked by things. The warfare, he said, was just so incredibly imbalanced that they would be like shocked. You know,
Sure.
guys would die from something like, I mean, not a marble, but like literally a shard of glass, and here they're, you know, half a mile off the earth.
When you make an improvised explosive device, what we call an IED, right there. It's a piece of wood. It's been cut in half, hollowed out, crammed full of forks,
Yeah.
broken glass, ball bearings, BBs, whatever, you know, screws and knives, or screws and nuts and bolts, and anything that'll fly through the air and hurt someone. Right? So a significant difference, and it's also indiscriminate. Right? It hurts a lot of people and anybody that happens to be in the area. Landmines are indiscriminate. This gives you an idea of where these attacks are taking place. This has become the common tactic because they can't stand toe-to-toe on the battlefield with the U.S. Army. Can't. And they didn't try to. Right? Was it Paul Wolfowitz or Richard Pearl told Dick Cheney that the war in Iraq was going to be a slam dunk? Be in there and out of there in 6 weeks. We have so much more firepower, so much more tech, so much more capacity. Should have read that, you know, Art of War thing. Right? So, significant difference in the way this battle is fought. It's been turned into a guerrilla war. That's neither, you know, side's fault. That's just the nature of the way it has happened. Okay? Also, significant challenge, just absolute whole-scale devastation. The country has been ripped apart, so the infrastructure of the country has been ripped apart. People talk about, oh, well, you know, things have kind of calmed down, so why don't we just go in and build schools and give some money? They don't have roads. They don't have schools. This was probably a school, right? This was probably a market. This was a neighborhood, right? And they've been completely destroyed, so you don't have the basic necessities for regular life. Another significant challenge is underdevelopment. I want to be careful here because I don't want to use a Western notion that says development is good and, you know, non-developed countries are backwards and everything like that. But there's a significant concern in terms of poverty, the ability of people to meet their needs when you have an economy that is, by all intents and purposes, the same as the economy was probably like 100 or 200 or 300 or 500 years ago in a lot of ways. It's not a lot different. Okay, so underdevelopment is at least a challenge to be faced, but we have to be careful about saying we don't want to turn, trying to turn Afghanistan into, you know, I don't know, Palm Beach or something. We have to be careful about making those kind of assessments about qualitative assessments about development. But it is a challenge. There's also a specific type of underdevelopment, and that is political development. Democracy has not existed here. And so we're all of a sudden saying, well, gee, why can't you, we're letting you vote now. Why don't you just all go to the ballot box and solve your problems that way? They don't have experience with democracy. Right? There aren't the political institutions that exist to allow for a working judicial system, a civil service, different ministries that will meet needs, a social safety net. They lack experience with democratic process, and yet we expect that, well, you're able to vote now, why aren't all your problems solved? Because you don't solve all of your problems just by the ability to ink your thumb and participate at the ballot box. It's a little bit more complicated than that. It will take decades and decades for that to happen. You got to remember that the United States has been around. We've had this thing called the Constitution 250 years, but we aren't really fully a democracy either, are we? So it's hard to expect another country to be fully democratic in the course of 10 years. As we mentioned before, these divisions within Afghanistan, there's a lot of intolerance. Not only do you have a wide variety of ethnicities, but they're spread out all over the country. And you also have another level that we have to add on top of this, and this is tribal affiliation. A lot of these areas base their loyalties on kinship groups, tribal groups. I've mentioned this in every lecture I've given, I think, this week, about how in this region of the world, people's first loyalty is to their tribal or kin group. Their second level of loyalty is to their ethnicity. Their third level of loyalty is to their religious affiliation. Then their fourth level of loyalty is to this thing called the nation. A lot of them don't even get that far. And so it is tribe, ethnicity, religious sect, nation. In order of level of, look how many there are, look how widespread it is. This is a problem we see with decolonization all over the world. Look at Africa. We've taken a variety of cultural groups and crammed them all into one particular political body. They might have had historical differences with one another. In other places, we've taken cultural groups and drawn international borders between them, separating their people. Right? And so these international borders, this Westphalian system of nation states, creates problems all over the globe because it doesn't correlate with these relationships that are actually existing on the ground and in people's hearts and minds. There's also gender and religious intolerance. Women struggle in this part of the world. Females struggle in this part of the world. I think we all know a little bit about that part, about the gender discrimination. There's also religious discrimination. I put these two pictures up because if you can see in the background, you see that big cave? You see the little town, village here, way back here? Sitting inside that is one of the largest statues of Buddhist statues on the face of the planet, carved right into the rock. Right, well, the Taliban went and they blew it up. Islamists, like maybe 80 years ago or something, went in and sawed off the face of the Buddha. And then the Taliban, a little while ago, a few years ago, they went in and with artillery blew the shit out of the thing and destroyed it. It's a World Heritage Site. But, that whole no false images thing that religions have. So lots of intolerance in terms of people trying to figure out how to get along and survive together. Part of that intolerance is the way people are treated. It's a war zone and bad things are going to happen. But these are the kind of images that are being spread all across the Islamic world of American soldiers mistreating the body, the corpse of a fallen Muslim warrior. That's sacrilege. That's pretty serious stuff to them. Hearing stories about the treatment of people in Bagram prison. Hearing stories about Qurans being burned or urinated on. Right? That's about as serious as it gets. And in this country, we're a little bit desensitized to religious humor and religious bigotry and people say things about different religions all the time, and we just kind of say, yeah, whatever. That's not the case in these countries. Right? It's not the same. So trying to understand those divides. You also have significant challenges in Afghanistan called Mother Nature. Big time earthquake zone in Afghanistan, devastating earthquakes, plus the infrastructure is not that well built to be up to earthquake code. It's not like Tokyo or San Francisco or wherever where big, 80-story buildings can sway like they're doing the hula, right? Here we're talking about mud and brick homes that crumble and fall. We also have massive flooding that takes place from time to time, and you don't have the infrastructure to meet the needs. And so you've got human suffering and natural disasters happening in the middle of a war zone, and it all becomes very complicated on top of each other. There's also significant challenges in the terrain. Very, very mountainous. A lot of people think, terrain, big deal. But look at that terrain. Look at the way our supply train has to make its way in. Very susceptible to ambushes, right? They have to check things out all along the way. You have these little villages and agriculture areas that exist in these huge mountain ranges, the valleys of these huge mountain ranges. And you wouldn't think that's that big of a deal until you start realizing a couple of things. We have to do airdrops rather than deliver supplies via truck. Sometimes they go awry because of air currents and stuff like this. This picture was taken because this particular airdrop, or maybe it was a generic airdrop, but an airdrop was blown off course and landed in the middle of the poppy fields of these farmers, and the military had to go in and negotiate with the farmers and say, yeah, we're sorry, our airdrop went offline or went off course and destroyed a bunch of your crops. He's angry that his crops have been destroyed. They're not angry that he's growing poppies because the farmers are a good source of local intelligence. The Army doesn't go after poppy farmers. They try to develop good relationships with them. In fact, you know what they're talking about right here? They're talking about how much monetary compensation these guys in uniform are going to give to these farmers to pay for their damaged and destroyed crops. Because hearts and minds, having to make good relations with the people. In addition, that's the only way this guy has made, and these people has a way of making a living. Cash crop. It's the only way they have of making a living. Also, think about if you had to go crawling into that. It doesn't look like a very secure job, does it? It looks a little scary to be doing something like that, or finding one that's even fortified. And so all those mountains going all over, they're particularly cavernous, lots of caves all over the place, kind of like the rat holes that people had to crawl through in the Vietnam War, and we've seen movies about that, and how people, suffer from that for years and years and years, about how terrifying and psychologically terrifying that is. They're also booby-trapped, right? So the terrain is very, very, very difficult. We also mentioned the drug trade. I think we've already talked about that one a little bit, enough already. We talk about, like the Canadian Parliament designed this graph that, compares all of Afghanistan's exports versus, or they're defining the non-opium exports. They're not very many. Right? Soldiers standing in the middle of the poppy field. What do they do when they find heroin? They burn it all, they destroy it. A heroin addict in the streets of Kabul. Very serious, don't know what to do about that. Also just simply understanding one another. I think a lot of times we think that, the Americans are hated there because we see those pictures, that we showed just a moment ago. But there's also a lot of important relationships that are being built here. Some of these folks are saying, hey, thank you for being here. Thank you for providing some security and some stability on the ground. That Taliban, they're mean. Right? Building these relationships. This isn't a standoff. This is a little get-together in the community square. They brought tea for the soldiers. There are little girls right in the middle of it. Right? So understanding each other and all of the differences between these two countries. So, and I'm sorry, this is a slide that actually shouldn't be on there. It was from the international organizations PowerPoint that I just used this morning to make this one. So, an awful lot of issues that you have to know a little bit about. You have to kind of explore this from a variety of different perspectives, look at a variety of different interests. This is not a simple conflict. And a lot of times we get into debates, or we hear people in class, or we hear people in the street, or we hear evening news broadcasters talking about it in incredibly simplistic terms. But what we need to do is try to make our arguments more nuanced, try to dig a little bit deeper into what is actually happening, and understand that you have to approach this issue from about 50 different angles in order to have a valid and meaningful approach to the topic, to the issue, etc. I would advise all of you to pay attention to this one, not only because it's an important issue in real life, but also because in your debate rounds, there will be debates that are straight up about Afghanistan. They get topics about Afghanistan. But Afghanistan will also be a likely impact scenario to relations disads, to politics disads. As we get closer to this withdrawal happening, then we're going to start hearing politics disads that will have, status of force agreement impact scenarios about what we should do about leaving our forces there, pulling them out, when to pull out, when not, etc. Okay, so it's an important issue to kind of stay abreast of, stay on top of, think about, how it's developing day by day by day by day, because it will change weekly, monthly, all the time. All right, good luck.